All right, we will go ahead and get started. It is top of the hour. Happy May. This is our May contribution to the ADEPT Academy. My name is Tom Horvath, and I am one of the ADEPT facilitators, and it's my honor to represent the entire ADEPT team in this installment of the ADEPT Academy. As you can see by the title page, today's topic is on the all-important subject of communication. So let's go ahead and get started. So just a quick reminder as to the ADEPT Academy. Why are we here? Why are you logging on and watching this, either live or as a recording? Well, we want to make sure that we have an opportunity to continue to connect with our alumni. When you go to an ADEPT program, you get into the routine of every other week meeting with us, and then the program ends. So the ADEPT Academy is a way for you to stay in touch with us and vice versa. Also, the ADEPT Academy really is a repository of topics. So you might want to go into our video library and pick a particular topic. While I will review some of the material in which you have already seen in one of our programs, about 50% of this content is brand new, where I'll be doing a drill down. So many times you can find some additional content if you look at one of the topics that you're interested in. As a professional member of the ADEPT Academy, you are invited to these monthly webinars, and you can either participate live as you are right now or via recording. There is a private LinkedIn group that we are getting started as the Academy continues to grow, and that's a way for ADEPT Academy, ADEPT alumni to connect with one another across industry boundaries, across geographies, post questions that you can interact with the facilitators as well. Also, you'll be getting and receiving some calendar reminders. So as you participate in this webinar, you are reminded through the calendar reminders of how you can actually apply many of the things that you are learning. So we'll be sending out things on an ongoing basis over the next couple of weeks just to spur your memory and prod you on to apply many of the things that you're learning. Also, as a professional member, you have the access to one of us at the ADEPT to simply coach. It's a 30-minute session. This could be around a career transition. It could be an obstacle right now that you're having in your current role, and you just need a sounding board. You need somebody objective. Reach out to us. We'll be more than happy to spend some time helping you with your next step. And then also, there are lots of online resources. So in addition to the video library, all of the different templates that you receive throughout the ADEPT process are also in a repository, and as an Academy member, you have access to those as well. Today, we obviously are talking about communication, but next month in June 11th, we're actually going to do active listening. So today we're going to do a drill down on what communication is, and particularly one- and two-way communication. But next month is an entire session on active listening. Communication is such a prevalent and important topic, we've decided to take a couple of months to provide additional information. And as I've mentioned before, all of these videos are archived, and if you have any question as to how to access that, just reach out to Tanya, and she'd be more than happy to connect you. So what are we going to do today? Well, we will review the 5 characteristics of ADEPT leaders. We're going to talk about the basics of communication, the definition of communication, and then identify and review some of the common barriers to communication. Then we'll do a deep dive into one-way communication. We'll remind you about BEER, and that's our acronym, as well as some tips on how to write more effective emails. We'll talk about two-way communication and the very important topic of nonverbal communication. And then we're going to round out our session today with a concept called leadership is a conversation. It's a particular article that I found particularly helpful in describing the importance of communication for us as leaders. So what are those 5 attributes for ADEPT leaders? Well, ADEPT leaders are aware. They're directed by goals and objectives. ADEPT leaders know how to execute. They know how to get things done inside the organization and even outside the organization. Because at the end of the day, what's important is what are we getting done? What are we executing on? Also, ADEPT leaders value and nurture people, because leadership is leading people. The work gets done through people. So we have to understand and appreciate the people that are in our lives, those that we are leading. And then finally, ADEPT leaders are people who are passionate about developing their own talent as well as all the talent around them. So when we talk about awareness, it's 3 levels. There's self-awareness, knowing how you are wired, knowing what your predispositions are, knowing your preferences, knowing how you speak or listen in today's topic of communication. And then there's other awareness. So these are other people that are on your team. They could be peers. They could be your boss. And as we increase our self-awareness, our other awareness is such that they're a lot different than us usually. So there's self-awareness, there's other awareness, and then the third level is the environment or the context, because all of that awareness is in the context of getting something done at work, whether it's a meeting, whether it's a project, whether it's a conversation. You have to understand the environment or the context, because that will have an influence on awareness, both what we're doing with the situation as well as what other people are doing with the situation. When we talk about being goal-directed, ADEPT leaders know what the vision is for the future. And in fact, this is something that they keep up front. They're constantly reinforcing and repeating where we are headed, where we are going, the mountain that we're going to climb or take. Even in the mundane, day in and day out life of work, they are constantly talking about where this is taking us. Big picture people. Also, goal-directed ADEPT leaders have abilities to not just talk about what the goal is, but what it means to them, what it means to you, what it means to every individual in the team and in the organization. And then they're very focused in such that, yes, these visions are far off into the future, but what is the most important thing now? Priorities constantly change within an organization and within a team, and goal-directed leaders are the ones that can constantly remind folks what is important today. What are the top 2, 3, 4 things in front of us for today, for this week, for this month? When we talk about execution, ADEPT leaders know how to get things done. They produce results, and it's not just bottom line results, and it's not just things that can be counted, but it's in the way that they get things done, the way that they inspire, the way that they motivate, the way that they treat their customers, the way that they treat their employees. But they know how to get things done. And their key is focus. A lot of noise is always happening around us as leaders, but ADEPT leaders know how to filter that noise out and know how to focus on what's most important. When we talk about being people-centric, ADEPT leaders understand the value and uniqueness of each and every person, and they see them as people, not necessarily as direct reports or people in the process. They know how each individual is motivated. Everyone gets motivated differently, so they take the time to understand each person. They also understand that each person has different capabilities, different strengths, different weaknesses, different opportunities for themselves to develop, and they're tuned into that. They don't think that everyone is the same and interchangeable. They see people as being unique, and they want to make sure that they inspire that uniqueness and develop that uniqueness. And in fact, when I'm talking about development, that ties right into talent management or talent awareness. So each individual has a bottle of talent that needs to be developed, and ADEPT leaders do that by creating vision and focusing on performance and coaching and rewarding the good performance and correcting performance that's a little subpar and providing resources and support. The ADEPT leader doesn't develop that particular talent, but they obviously enable the other person to develop that talent. All right, so that was a quick reminder as to what an ADEPT leader is, but what about communication? That's our topic today. What is communication? Well, there are lots of definitions for communication, but the definition that is probably most familiar to you is the one that we have provided you during one of our programs. And we say it's the giving or the exchange of information between 2 or more people. So it's you and at least one other person, or it could be you and hundreds or thousands of other people. And the goal is some type of shared understanding. It isn't just that someone is listening or that someone is talking or someone is writing an email and someone is receiving an email. The goal is shared understanding. So the real quick definition that we have is message sent equals message received. Ultimately, that is successful communication, and that is really why we are trying to trying to communicate. I'm here communicating in this form, in this medium, and I'm hoping that the messages that I'm sending, the information that I'm giving you, is being received in the way that I am intending it. If you are hearing me and listening to me and getting some other meaning out of it, then our communication hasn't been successful. That applies to our session today, but it applies to every single time we are communicating with another individual or a group of people. One of the reasons why communication is so difficult, and this is a pretty primary, pretty basic model of communication, but I think it does a great job of explaining and illustrating all of the parts within any message. So you have someone that has some information. Maybe it's, I want to tell you what the weather is, or maybe it's a question. Where would you like to go to lunch today? Well, that's information. Well, the sender produces that information, or maybe that information is given to the sender. So in the case of where do we want to go to lunch today, as the sender, I'm just thinking, well, it's about lunchtime, and usually we go to lunch together, so I'm going to ask the question, where would you like to go to lunch today? So the sender is encoding a message. Now, that encoding could be me calling you up, it could be texting, it could be emailing. Those are different modes of communication, but I'm taking my idea and I'm encoding it into that message. So for this purpose, let's assume the message is me just simply popping up out of my cube and saying, hey, where do you want to go to lunch today? That's the message. Well, I'm not just asking the wall to go to lunch with me, I'm asking people to go to lunch with me, so they have to take that message and they have to decode it. They have to take the words, in this case, of what I'm saying, and maybe even how I'm saying it, and they have to decode it to figure out what it means to them. And then that reaches their understanding. Now, if communication is successful, they're going to respond with an answer of, well, I'm not going to lunch today. Or, yeah, it's time to go to lunch today. Why don't we go to fill in the blank? You'll see the cloud in this particular model, though, which is great because constantly there's noise in every communication that we send. And it's this noise that surrounds our communication that many times influences the person's ability to receive the message. So, for example, if I stood up and said, hey, where do we want to go to lunch today? If there was noise, and you could take that literally, let's say a fire alarm was going off or there was loud music playing, well, the person might not even hear my spoken word. Or maybe that noise is they're already on the phone or they're deep involved, deeply focused in some work. And they can kind of hear me ask the question, but their noise happens to be that they're not concentrating on me and they're focused on their work. There could be a lot of noise, which then could take away from the effectiveness of that communication. Now, the example I just gave you was me saying, hey, where do you want to go to lunch? Well, it could be a text message. Hey, where do you want to go to lunch? And the noise could be that someone doesn't get the text message, or they don't look at the text message, or they just glance at the text message, and that might impact the successful communication. So noise comes in all shapes and sizes and forms. But we have to be aware of it. But in addition to the noise, just understanding that the way that the sender may encode the information might not be the same way that the receiver decodes the information. And that is where we get classic miscommunication, where the information that seems clear to me, the sender, your understanding of it as the receiver was not the same, which means communication really didn't happen. So again, message sent equals message received. Some barriers, and we review this in class with you, these 4 common communication barriers. The first one is perceptions, and perceptions really just speak to our wiring. Everyone has a tendency or a difference in how they might perceive things or perceive communication or interpret communication. It's not good, it's not bad, it's just everyone has different perceptions. With my example of who wants to go to lunch or where are we going to go to lunch today, some people might not care about going to lunch, so they're going to completely tune me out, whereas other people might go, yeah, I want to be with the group, I want to go to lunch. Perceptions, we all have them and they're all very different, but those perceptions obviously are a barrier to successful communication. And then we have assumptions, and assumptions are things like stereotypes, biases, our own personal agenda. So going back to my example, and I'm sorry if I'm making you hungry, maybe I'm asking the question because I want to go to get Chinese food today. So I'm going to assume as soon as everyone says, yeah, let's go to lunch today, that they too want to go for Chinese food because I have a personal agenda. Or maybe it's a stereotype or a bias. But we all have assumptions, both the sender as well as the receiver. And then there's different styles of communication. And the style could be an individual who is a talker or not a talker, or maybe someone who likes to write a lot of detail into their messages, and they would always send a text or send an email as opposed to picking up the phone and asking, or jumping out of their cube and just hollering a little louder. So everyone has different styles. Again, not good, not bad, but everyone's communication style could be a communication barrier. Another example of style would be, very direct communicators, and then people who kind of beat around the bush. And then finally, the fourth common barrier is listening skills. When people listen to a message or read an email or a text, the way they interpret it, they might not have successful or developed listening skills. And that, quite frankly, is why we're going to spend our whole session next month in June talking about active listening, because as we receive information, as we receive communication, that's on us to try to understand it as best we can. So those listening skills relate to active listening, and again, come back next month and we're going to spend the entire time on that. So how do we interpret messages? And again, these percentages should look familiar. We go over these. This is the famous study talking about, so when people are trying to communicate their feelings, what really matters the most? And this research showed that about 7% of the message or the person receiving the message were the actual words that someone used when trying to communicate their feelings. 38% were how the words were spoken, and that means how loud the person spoke, or how softly, or how fast, or how slow, or the inflection just in the voice. And then 55% of successful communication was around facial expressions and body language. So what I want to talk about now is one-way communication, and in one-way communication, the only thing we're relying on are the words. So it's the 7% of the message. Typically, when we talk about one-way communication, a voicemail, an email, texting, any kind of written form, memos, policies and procedures, these are all examples of one-way communication. Yes, someone could return the email or return the voicemail, but it's not required. It's one-way communication. It's someone sending information out with no expectation of any kind of feedback coming their way. So one of the things that we always teach you, and this is one of our most referred to acronyms, BEER. When we're talking about one-way communication, think of it as using BEER. Be brief, empathetic, engaging, and readable. So in a little bit more detail, when we mean brief, we mean brief. Get to the point, okay? If you can say it in one sentence, don't use two sentences. Also, in communicating one way, and let's use the example of an email. Well, an email has pretty typical format, right? There's a sender, there's a receiver, there's a subject line, and then a whole bunch of a white space that we get to fill in. So use proven formats, meaning in the case of email, go ahead and use bullet points. Summarize things in your communication. Even if something as short as a text, being able to use a summary format as opposed to here's 6 or 7 sentences of detail. Also, many times, particularly in a work setting, we might be referring to a report or some event, a meeting. Go ahead and mention that. That would be great because you can't assume that someone knows exactly what you're talking about. And then also, as far as using some type of a proven format, typically the communication has some urgency. You need that person to do something, or maybe you need to get information back from that person. So if there is urgency around this communication, then make sure you communicate that. Okay, hey, I need to hear by 3 o'clock today, or close of business tomorrow, or whatever that happens to be. Again, we cannot assume that someone knows when they need to get information back to you. So be brief, though. Be brief. Also be empathetic, which basically means putting yourself in their shoes. So where are they right now? What's going on in their world? Are they preparing for a large meeting that's going to happen this afternoon? Because if they are, they might not be giving your communication that much attention. Or it might be a busy, crazy time of the week or of the month for them. So try to understand where they are right now. Have some empathy for them. Also, ask yourself, well, what do they know about this particular topic? Again, it might have been a shared experience in a meeting, or maybe it's just word on the street. Can we assume that they know what we're talking about? So be empathetic, put yourself in their shoes. What information do they know? What information do they need? Also, anticipate any questions that they might have, and go ahead and answer those questions briefly. But go ahead and address that right now. That avoids the back and forth, sending a communication and then someone saying, well, what are you talking about? Oh, I'm talking about the meeting. Oh, well, what meeting? Oh, the meeting that happened last Thursday. And back and forth we may go. So anticipate some of the questions that they might have. Also, and this is more of art than it is science, but the balance between too little information and too much information. And unfortunately, I can't give you a formula for that or even a percentage breakdown, but based on the topic, based on the person that you were sending the information to, you have to try to strike a balance. The second E in BEER, be brief, be empathetic, be engaging. So what's in it for them? Why should they care? So write in such a way that you easily communicate to them why they should care, what they should do, and make sure that what's in it for them is included in your information, also in your communication. Also, be logical when you are communicating. Don't assume that if you start at A and jump to Z, that they're going to understand all the steps in there. Be very logical in your communication. Again, not giving too much information, but just enough. I call it the breadcrumb method, but lay out the breadcrumbs, okay? And then finally, the R in BEER is be readable. In your one-way communication, make it easy to read. Make it short. Again, sentences are better than paragraphs. Also, in the case of email, use bullet points. Usually bullet points draw someone's eyesight and attention to the bullet point themselves, where you can be very brief. You don't even have to use an entire sentence when you use a bullet-pointed list. Also, help the reader understand, and that might mean giving a picture. You probably have heard that saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So in the example here, whether it's a pie chart or maybe it's just some results from a report, if you can snip that and paste it into your communication, it will help increase the probability that the communication is happening. Also, one reminder on being readable, we're talking about work-to-work, business-to-business kind of communication. Be professional. Okay? Be professional. Don't use acronyms. Don't use smiley faces. Don't use some of the text abbreviations. You can't assume that the other person understands what that means. Also, in being professional is reread your message before you send it. Catch mistakes. Sometimes, and particularly in email and text, sometimes there's an autocomplete function, right? So you type in a couple of letters and then the computer says, oh, well, here, I think this is what you're about to type. Sometimes that is wrong. So going back and rereading the communication, proofreading the communication will help you catch that. It's embarrassing when you send out something where a word is misspelled or it's the wrong word and the computer accidentally put it there for you. So still talking about one-way communication, probably the most common one-way communication for all of us is email. So these are just 10 tips on how to write a better, more professional email. Subject line. Use the subject line. Don't put common things in the subject line like, well, checking in, following up, touching base. Well, touching base on what? Following up on what? So you can use touching base or following up, but maybe a dash and then yesterday's meeting or first quarter results or something like that. Make sure that the subject line is something that entices the reader to read the rest of the message. Also, very similar to a headline in a newspaper, you want to have your main point be up front. And if that's not in the subject line, then definitely that first sentence, you need to tell them why. Don't bury the main point. Lead with the main point. Also, in communication, be specific. Don't assume. Don't assume that they know. Go ahead and spell it out. Again, briefly, but go ahead and spell it out. Back to that, to the breadcrumbs. Also, don't use all caps. All caps in an email where all the letters are capitals many times is interpreted as I am shouting at you. Okay? So your keyboard, both on your cell phone and on your computer, has the ability to use a cap or a lowercase. Well, use both of them. Don't send a message with all caps unless it is an emergency and unless you are angry. And even then, I would probably coach you not to send all caps. Don't use abbreviations. This is something that I just mentioned in the readable part of beer, but people don't necessarily understand every abbreviation. While you might be comfortable in using text speak, they might not know what PLZ means. They might not know WUWT, which is what is up with that. I had to look that one up myself, quite frankly, when I saw this in the article. So don't use those abbreviations because not everyone understands them and even understands what they are. Another one, be brief and polite. So we've already talked about being brief, but if you're communicating with someone, you're not losing any points if you're polite. I mean, be professional, be polite. Remember what mommy told you, please and thank you gets you a long way. So yes, even in the communications, saying please and thank you for the information, thank you for the feedback, and could you please make sure that your team addresses this in the next meeting or whatever it is. Just common courtesies. Another tip for effective emails is to make sure that you're using your signature block. So your name, your phone number, getting this communication from you, and I want to call you on the phone, but your signature block doesn't have your phone number. And maybe I don't have your phone number. Maybe I'm not at my desk. Maybe it's not saved in my phone. So making sure that your signature block has all the information required in order for someone to identify you appropriately by name, position, company, but then ways to get a hold of you. Now, obviously, if this is an email, they should have your email address, but don't even assume that because they could be sending this on to someone else. So in that signature block, making sure your email, your cell phone, your desk phone, ways for me to get a hold of you. Also, and I mentioned this, reread or proofread your message before sending send. Many times you'll catch double words, you'll catch misspellings. Again, your communication is a reflection on you. And then finally, the number 10 tip in the 10 tip list is making sure that you're prompt in returning in returning email messages, okay? A lot of people have a sunset rule where, they don't want to close the day without at least responding, or a 24-hour rule. But be prompt. When someone is responding to an email and it's 2 days or 4 days or older, that's really communicating to me that you're not on top of it and this really didn't make that much difference to you. So be prompt in replying. So this slide, we already talked about how 7% of the message is just the words. And again, when you are doing one-way communication, text, email, voicemail, that's all you rely on. It's the words that you are using. Now, 55% of successful messages are the facial expression or the body language. So I want to spend some time drilling down on body language. So this would concern itself with two-way communication where it's face-to-face, or I'll even say video-to-video, FaceTime to FaceTime, so that you can see the other person. So it could be in person or it could be digitally face-to-face. So 5 roles of nonverbal communication. One role is repetition. So making sure that the nonverbal communication is consistent with and reinforces the words that I'm saying. So in the example here, an angry look confirms an angry response. So it repeats or it confirms the communication. That's one role of nonverbal communication. Another role, and you don't necessarily want this, could be contradiction, where the nonverbal communication contradicts the message. So maybe you just shared with me some awful thing that you're going through. Maybe it was a loss. Maybe it was a fight with a spouse or a kid or a coworker, and I'm listening, but then as I'm responding, I've got a smile on my face. Well, that smile on my face would not be consistent with the information that you've shared with me and probably my response. Well, I'm so sorry that you lost your job. It just watching me, it doesn't fit. So sometimes nonverbal communication can provide a contradiction. Now, again, you probably don't mean that, but you've got to be aware of what your nonverbals are. Also, another role of nonverbal communication is substitution. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. So we're in a meeting. Let's just hypothetically say someone in that meeting is the one that always talks, is just kind of showboating, sharing their ideas because they think they're the smartest person in the room, and maybe this person even has a reputation. So we're in a meeting together, and that person starts to do what they do, and I look over at you, and I don't say anything, but I just roll my eyes. And that rolling of my eyes is nonverbal communication, and it's probably communicating, here we go again. So substitution, nonverbal communication can take the place of verbal communication. A fourth role of nonverbal communication is that it can complement or complete, further reinforce the communication. So if I'm congratulating you on a job well done, well, a pat on the back or a handshake could be a way of nonverbal communication complementing my communication. And then finally, the fifth role is accenting. I don't necessarily encourage this, though it's a good example. So if I'm sharing in a meeting and it's information and I'm pretty passionate about it, pounding on the table would be a way to accent the information. Now, I said I wouldn't necessarily, because most people don't like to communicate with people who are constantly pounding the table, but another example might be I might point at something on the slide, or I might point to something in a report. So accenting is a way that nonverbal communication supports verbal communication. So we just talked about the 5 roles of nonverbal communication. What about the types of nonverbal communication? Well, there's facial expression. When I say facial expression, yeah, it's the whole package here. It could be what the eyebrows are doing, or what the smile or the mouth is doing, or the forehead. I have a tendency to raise my eyebrows, and there's lines across my forehead. Those are all parts of my facial expressions when it comes to nonverbal. And then there's body movements or posture. Am I sitting? Am I standing? Are we walking? Am I looking down, and am I holding my hands across my chest, right? Am I going like this? Oh, I can't wait till this is finally over. So our body movements and our posture, obviously, are nonverbal communication. And there's gestures, right? Commonly understood gestures like a wave or a point or come here. I don't know what we're talking about. Again, I might not even have to say anything, but those gestures are a way of communicating. There's eye contact, very important, eye contact. We're talking about face-to-face communication or digital-to-digital communication, and eye contact is very important. I always joke, our mothers taught us this, maybe she was correcting us and she said, now you look at me when I'm talking to you. But if we're looking at each other, that's showing that I am interested, or I'm at least focused on you as we are communicating. So eye contact is another form of nonverbal communication that we have to be aware of. Then there's touch. And when we say touch, it could be that pat on the back. It could be a handshake, a tap on the shoulder. In some cases, a controlling grip on the arm when we're shaking their hand. Now, we've got to be careful with this touch, because we don't want to invade people's space. We don't want to touch someone inappropriately in the workforce, obviously. However, that common handshake or a brief, maybe elbowing someone, those would be some examples of nonverbal communication. And then there's space. In fact, I just referred to this, where all of us have a comfort level. And for some people, if you get any closer than about 2 feet, you're in my space. Other people, you can get right up in their face. But you have to respect that. Most people don't want you nose to nose or even inches away, or to a point where I could even feel the saliva coming out of your mouth. And I've got to be careful of that sometimes in a teaching situation, because I'm constantly talking, and I want to respect that space. And then finally, there's voice as a form of nonverbal communication. And the whole voice, and keep in mind this is over 50% of the message. It could be the timing, the volume of it. So nonverbal communication, 5 roles, and there are a lot of different types of nonverbal communication that we need to be aware of. And just as this slide indicates, these are all nonverbal. We can look at each one of these pictures and assume, we wouldn't know for sure, but assume what the person is at least feeling or what the person might be trying to communicate. Some of these faces are a bit tense and a tad bit angry. Some of these facial expressions are one of surprise. Some are fear. Some are defiance. Some are maybe a bit flirtatious. Nonverbal communication. You've got to be aware of what's going on with your entire body as it relates to communication. Also keep in mind, and we kind of started with this, communication is tough. Communication is hard. I mentioned in our diagram all the different kinds of noise that can happen. Well, some of that noise is on us. It could be the thoughts that we have going in our heads as well as the person we're trying to communicate with. So there could be thoughts or feelings or perceptions of, oh, here he goes again. So that's part of the noise that is created in this communication. Again, that's both on the part of the sender and the receiver. Also, part of that noise are distortions. And I like the example here, just like a garbled radio station. When we're not exactly tuned in and there's external noise, distortions, we really can't understand the message. And the distortions include the nonverbal communication. It includes the verbal, the tone of voice or the volume of voice. It might actually be the setting. The setting of being in an office, each of us on the other side of the desk, is a lot different than being in a large foyer or in a large restaurant that's really noisy. So we've got to be concerned about the kind of distortions, even the setting of the meeting. And then obviously there's the communication style, and not the communication styles are good or bad, but we might have different communication styles, and that could add to distortion. The reminder here is that we, as the sender of information, need to take responsibility. And next month, I'm even going to tell you that as the receiver, the active listener, you need to take responsibility. Because if the goal is successful communication, message sent equals message received, if I'm a part of that equation, I want to take responsibility to make sure that either my message has been received accurately or that I'm receiving your message accurately. And the way you take responsibility is sometimes you need to flex or adjust your style in communication. You obviously need to be aware of what's going on. You might need to ask questions to clarify what they're hearing or what they think they are hearing. So the idea of improving communication is each person taking responsibility in order for communication to happen. Now, the final topic that I'm going to discuss today is leadership as a conversation. And this is a great article. I would encourage you to do a Google. You can see there the title of the article is Leadership as a Conversation. It was an article that was published back in 2012 in Harvard Business Review. But summarizing that article very quickly here, the authors say that leadership communication, or successful organizational communication, come down to 4 I's: intimacy, interactivity, inclusion, and intentionality. And the authors did a lot of different studies. They did a lot of interviews to find out who the best communicators were, and then they started to analyze what made those people some of the best communicators, and they came up with these 4 topics, or these 4 items, 4 characteristics. So I'm going to briefly go over them. The intimacy. What do we mean by intimacy? Well, successful communicators get close to the people they're talking to. Now, I don't mean proximity. I'm talking about emotionally they can connect with their audience. They can take, and this could be someone from headquarters talking to a frontline employee, but they have a way of communicating where that gap from a high-level employee to a lower-level employee is diminished. Or maybe it is spatial. Maybe I'm on the East Coast communicating to someone on the West Coast. But somehow through the communication, it's like we're together. It doesn't matter that we are separated by thousands of miles. Also, Other aspects of intimacy in the communication is that there's a connection emotionally or mentally with the person. And overall, they are continually gaining trust. So intimacy also equals how much do I trust this person? And you probably can think of people now, whether they're in politics or business or maybe even in entertainment, but you have heard them enough, you've watched them enough where you really trust them. Now, you've never met them, but somehow they've been able to form this intimacy with you. Also, other characteristics of intimacy and communication is that they know how to listen. It's not just them talking or writing, but they also want to hear what you have to say, and they are good listeners. And these speakers, these communicators, these writers have a way of getting personal with us, and that might be in a two-way communication where I might call you by name, but even if I'm communicating to hundreds or thousands of people, there are things or stories that I might tell that make me a little bit more personal, and that could be me sharing, or, and presidents do this with State of the Union addresses, they'll point out to someone up in the gallery and specifically tell their story. It's a way of them getting personal, but a way of them increasing the intimacy of their communication. The second I was interactivity. They promote dialogue. They want to talk with their employees. It's not just a one-way communication, here's the memo, or thanks for coming to my 25-minute speech. They ask for questions. They ask for feedback. They ask for people to comment in a chat or electronic chat or something like that. So there's some form of interactivity to make what typically is one-way communication, two-way communication. The third I is inclusion. These great communicators, yes, they can communicate with me or they can communicate with my team or the entire company, but they also see everyone in the organization as communicators. So they give voices to everyone. They see every employee as a communicator, every employee as a brand ambassador, someone who is representing the organization in everything that they do. They include employees in thinking. So it's not just all the great ideas come from corporate or come from me because I'm a great leader. Not at all. They're constantly soliciting and giving credit to people who become thought leaders. And they love to tell stories. And usually stories have many characters. So these communicators, as they're telling stories, may be describing characters that really sound like you or really sound like something that you've experienced. So an additional way of connecting. And then the final I is that these communicators are intentional. Okay, they just don't talk or communicate to talk or communicate. There's a purpose for it. Okay, there is a topic. There is a focus to their communication. And even if that order or purpose rather doesn't come out in the conversation, these communicators will make sure that they do. And whether that's spoken word or whether that's written word, you always know why they are saying something or why they are asking you questions. And they always make sure that their conversations are strategically relevant to what is facing the organization right now. All right, well, in some cases, we just scratched the surface of communication, but we talked about the 5 characteristics of adept leaders. We talked about what communication is, message sent equals message received. We talked about the common barriers, and those 4 that we share with you are only 4. That is not a complete list. There are a lot of barriers when it comes to communication. We talked about one-way communication, specifically BEER, be brief, be empathetic, be engaging, and be readable. We also shared 10 email tips because email is a form of one-way communication. We then talked about two-way communication, the face-to-face communication, whether it's in person or whether it's digitally. We talked about the huge role and importance of non-verbal communication. And then finally, we wrapped up with leadership is a conversation with the 4 I's. Well, I hope you have some questions. So in my attempts to be interactive and inclusive, I would encourage you, if you're live with us today, to go ahead and type in a question in the chat box. That's in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Or if you are watching this video and we're not live, feel free to email me any questions that you might have. So while you're thinking of a few questions to send my way, I would like to throw out an idea here for you, and it's time to refresh. Many times in our programs, You might have been exposed to the ADEPT 360 survey instrument or the DISC analysis. And I just wanted to remind you, if it's been a year or 2 or 3 since your last 360, you know what, you might want to update that. So feel free to give us a call. We'd be more than happy to execute that for you and give you a better picture on the 360. And on the DISC, the DISC system that we use has a lot of additional reporting capabilities. So if DISC is something that really intrigued you when we went over it in class, and it's been 6 months, 12 months, and you say, man, I wish we could get even more, give us a call. There might be some additional reports that we could generate that would give you additional insight into your DISC profile. So I see I've got a question already. Thanks so much to AKC who is chatting this in. What trends do I see in communication? Well, that's a great question because things are constantly changing in the workplace, and one of the great things about my role is I get to be part of a lot of different workplaces. So this is just going to be Tom's opinion, what Tom is seeing and what Tom is reading. One thing I would say is that our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter. I mean, it used to be that people would read long emails. Well, now I'm finding they're not even reading the short emails or not even reading the text or taking the time. They might look at the subject line. They might look at the first line, but I'm amazed that people aren't taking the time to actually read communications. Now, I can't make you read my email. I can't force you. I can't change you. So maybe one of the takeaways there is that people are having shorter and shorter attention spans. While in my communication, it needs to be shorter and shorter. Another thing that I see often is I might send a communication out and ask 2 questions or 3 questions in that email, thinking, wow, that's a really efficient use of my time, and it'll be an efficient use of their time. And then they respond, and they might respond or answer 1 of the 3 questions that I asked. And I'm left with sending another email then. So one of the things that I've started to do is I've avoided putting 2 or 3 or 4 items in one particular email, and I just might send a very, very short message asking 1 question at a time, because that seems to be how people are digesting it. Now, I'm not saying you never ask more than 1 question or address more than 2 or 3 issues in an email, because depending upon the context, you might need to. But I have found just a short bite size, hey, give me an answer on this, or what do you think about this, as opposed to a formally written. Another thing that I would recommend, with people's short attention spans, and usually when I say that, their attention spans are short in front of the screen, whether it's the computer screen or whether it's their cell phone. So pick up the phone, talk to people, catch them in the hallway, face-to-face communication. I'm amazed, and this is kind of a paradox, but people are so busy, and we all are, but we won't take the time to read a 5-sentence email. But if someone comes to our door and says, hey, you got a minute? We'll spend 5 or 10 or 15 minutes just shooting the breeze with them. Think about that. So I have started to just simply pick up the phone and have face-to-face communication. So the trend that I'm seeing, shorter attention spans. In response to that trend, I'm making my messages even more shorter and simpler, and actually forcing some 2-way communication, which is more effective, by giving them a call or catching them face-to-face. But great question, great question. One other, as I'm thinking about this one, in an office setting, one of the communication tools that we suggest to you in our programs is a chat sheet. So, instead of constantly contacting someone 5 or 6 times throughout the day, you just simply write down what you need to talk to them about, and then you visit them once or twice a day. That's another way to effectively get people's attention. If we know, or if this is the one time today that we're going to be meeting, and we've scheduled this sit down for 5 or 10 minutes, well then, hopefully I've got your attention so that I can cover multiple tactics. So that chat sheet is another tool that we give to you that I would also recommend in this case. Another question, you mentioned intimacy in communication. Can you please explain that in a business setting? Yeah, the I word, intimacy. Now, obviously, we aren't talking about flirting or some kind of communication that would be unprofessional and inappropriate. So, the intimacy word can be misunderstood. So if not intimacy, how about just connection? I think we all have had the opportunity to connect with someone, a leader, a coworker, where it just seems like I get them. I get their communication. They're communicating what's important to me. They might even be communicating in a way that would be similar to the way I would want to communicate. I might be brief, they're brief. Wow, we just connect. So if intimacy is a word that might conjure up some negative things, replace it with connectivity or connection. You want to make sure that your communication connects with people, okay? Not necessarily, gives them goosebumps or they just, flirt their eyes at you. No, that would be unprofessional, but that you connect with them. So you want to make sure that the message is relatable to them, okay? Use their words, not your words. The vocabulary matches their vocabulary. Don't use a whole bunch of highfalutin acronyms or words if that's not the way that they commonly talk. So you want to do the best that you can to connect. Now, within that connection, there is a form of intimacy because connecting with someone certainly means I'm on the same page with them. But the word intimacy does not, and I want to be very clear, does not mean anything that would be unprofessional or that the other person could see as threatening. So if it's not intimacy, think about connection. How can I connect with my audience? How can I connect better with people? It's a two-way street, both in how I'm communicating and what I'm hearing back. And many times that connection is sealed when communication happens. Message sent equals message received. Great. Any other questions? I'll wait just a few moments to see if there's anyone else that has a question for our chat room. Keep in mind, if you're watching this via video from our library, feel free to email me at thorvath@becomeadept.com. Would welcome your thoughts and reactions. Well, I don't see any other questions, so with that, I will wind us up. Thank you so much for being a part of this particular edition of the Academy. As I mentioned, next month we'll be on the topic of active listening, which is the other half. I can communicate to you, but in the case of two-way communication, am I being an active listener? So we'll talk about that topic and give you lots of more tips and tricks that you can use to become a more effective communicator. Thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you next month, and hope that you have a fantastic week ahead and that you continue to become more of an adept leader. Take care.